Do you have a fabric panel in your closet and are you wondering what to do with it? Well, I have 4 project ideas for you. These projects are quick and easy and will take between 30 minutes and 2 hours each. Squares in the panel that I'm using are approximately 6 inches in diameter. I think any panel will work for these projects as long as the squares are between 5 and 7 inches. You really could use any size squares, but you may end up with a really big or a really small finished project. The first project that we're going to start with is a toiletry organizer. This can be set up to be used with toothpaste, toothbrushes, or it could be used for face cleaning supplies or even nail supplies. Whatever personal hygiene products that you would like to organize and stow or give as a gift, you can put in this little toiletry organizer. If you have items that you think you might want to put in this organizer, you might want to gather them up so that you can measure them to make sure they fit in the sleeves. To start this project, you will need to pick a front and a back for your organizer. You can choose 2 adjoining squares like this chicken and crab. You can choose 2 separate squares and sew them together to make a front and a back. Or you can use one of your fabric panel squares and a piece of scrap fabric that you have on hand. If you decide to use 2 individual squares, you'll need to sew them together where your middle of your book would be. I used a 1/4 inch seam on this one. I chose to use a square from my panel and then some border fabric that was in the panel to make the back of this little organizer. You'll want to pick out a piece of fabric that you can use for the inside of your organizer and for the sleeve of the organizer. You'll take this fabric and cut it exactly the same size as your 2 squares that you have sewn together. And you'll need 2 pieces, one for the inside and one for the pocket or sleeve. You should now have 3 pieces of fabric. The piece that's the front and back cover of your organizer, a piece for the lining of your organizer, and a piece that we're going to make the pocket out of. So the piece of fabric that you're going to make the pocket out of or the sleeve out of, you're just going to fold that in half lengthwise. And you can finger press that or you can take it to the iron. So this piece of fabric that we've folded in half longwise, we're going to take to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch down from the folded edge. Here I've sewn with black thread so that you could see it on camera, but you can use any color that you would like. Now we're going to mark the fabric so that we can sew lines in it to hold our individual toiletries in place. Specific items that you would like to put on this, you would want to measure them to make sure the sleeves are big enough. You will want to mark the center of your book because we will be sewing a seam down it later on in the project. Do this simply by finger pressing it or marking it with an erasable pen. Organizer, I made my first mark over 1.5 inches from the edge. Then I moved my ruler over 3 inches from that first marking. I knew there was going to be a mark in the center, so I skipped that. And to the left of the center, I made a mark 1 inch from the center line. I moved my ruler over 1 inch and made another mark. And from there I came over to the left 2 inches. After I marked my fabric, I took it to the sewing machine and I sewed from the raw edge to the folded edge and then backstitched to make it secure. Here's a photo of the stitching that I did. To look at some of the items I was thinking about putting in the pockets. Front and back cover, we're just going to add a piece of batting and do some top stitching. Whatever you would like to do. You can free motion quilt or you can just put it under a sew machine and do some lines to hold the batting in place. Back of the organizer, I just sewed straight lines down the black blocks, and for the front of it I just did a little free motion quilting to hold the batting in place. This one I just sewed around the squares and then I did free motion quilting on the front. Once you have the top stitching finished, you want to trim off the extra batting. This would be a good time to check to see if your fabric is square. Sometimes the panels are a little wonky and stretched out of shape, so you might want to check it now while you're trimming it to see if it's nice and straight. Now that our outside of our organizer is all trimmed up, we're going to sew our lining to the outside cover. We're going to put right sides together and we're going to pin that or clip that in place. This little organizer, you're going to need some type of closing device. I'm using a button and a hair tie, so you can wrap the hair tie around the button when you want to close the organizer. So I'm going to stick the hair tie about halfway in the middle of my panel where the back of the book would be. Once you have that positioned in the middle, you're going to want to pin it in place or use clips to keep it from moving on you while you're sewing. Pin your lining to your cover, and you should mark it because you want to leave an opening for turning it right side out, and you don't want to forget about that when you're sewing and have to rip it out. So I normally mark it where I want to start and stop with double pins. You're going to want to start sewing at your double pins about a 1/4 inch from the edge all the way around to the other double pins, and you want to backstitch at the beginning of the end to secure it. It's also a good idea to backstitch over the hair tie to make sure you have that securely in place. You want to clip off your corners so you can turn it right side out and get nice sharp corners. And you want to clip off that hair tie. You don't need that extra inside the bag. After that, you'll turn your organizer right side out and you'll push out your corners. Once you have your bag turned right side out and your corners pushed out, you're going to take it to the ironing board and you're going to tuck under that area that you left open, and you're going to iron it nice and flat because we're going to take it to the sew machine and we're going to sew around the outer edge to close up that opening. Now that the raw edge is tucked under and it's ironed nice and flat, we're going to take it to the sew machine and we're going to sew completely around the outside edge, coming back to where we started, and we're also going to sew right down the center. Now our organizer is finished and it is looking good. All we have left to do is to pick out a button and sew it on. Quick and easy project, great for gift giving. You can give it empty or you can fill it with travel size toiletries. Project number 2 is wall art, and for this you're going to need a small canvas. See, my panel square is a little small for this canvas, so we're going to add fabric to the square to make it big enough to wrap around the edges. For this I'm going to use coordinating fabric. I'm going to pick black and a piece of batting to kind of make it poofy and to do some top stitching. You're going to need to measure from your square around your canvas to see how many inches of fabric you're going to have to use to get this to wrap around the back. You're better off to have too much than not enough. For me, I think I can get away with adding 3 inches of material all around my square to make it wrap around the back of the canvas. Make sure you have enough fabric. You're going to need a 6-inch long piece for the top and bottom, and then 2 pieces for each of the sides. If I'm doing my math right for my project, I need about 36 inches of fabric to make that work. To start off, I sewed a piece of fabric to the top of my square and my bottom square. I pressed it open, and then I'm going back and I'm going to sew a piece on each side of the square so that I have a black border around the whole piece. Here I'm just double checking to make sure I have enough fabric to wrap completely around the canvas. I don't want to go any further and not have enough fabric to wrap around. So now that I'm sure that my panel is big enough, I'm going to go ahead and iron it nice and flat. Next step is to add a piece of batting and do some top stitching to make the panel look a little more decorative. For this panel, I did some free motion quilting around the panda and in the red area. And then I just went around with my walking foot around the square to do some top stitching in the black area of the border. For this project, if I were making these to sell, I would probably invest in some black batting. I think it would have looked better overall because some of the white fuzz kind of pulled through on my black and gave me a lot of lint. But for who I'm making these for, they're fine just the way they are. Once you're finished your top stitching, you're going to want to trim off the extra batting because we're going to get ready to staple the panel to the canvas. You will want to center your panel on your canvas and then flip it over to get ready for stapling. Staple one side and then staple the opposite side and then work on your next 2 sides. To pull your fabric tight but not too tight, and work on your corners to tuck them in. These really make great inexpensive wall art, and they look great when you hang them in pairs or sets. Project number 3 is a hanging wall organizer. For this project, you'll need to pick out 6 fabric squares for the front of your pockets. If you are using 6-inch squares, you will need 2 pieces of background fabric that coordinate with your squares, a piece of batting, and a piece of interfacing that are approximately 25 inches by 17 inches, and we'll cut them later on in the video. Laying out our pockets right now, just to get an idea of the layout, we'll cut our background fabric later. I wanted my pockets to go red, white, red. I laid my pockets out about 2 inches apart, and that's how I came up with the background fabric being about 25 by 17. You may want this bigger or smaller depending on what you're going to put in your pockets. We are going to sew our squares onto another piece of fabric so that our pockets are 2 layers thick. Here I have just cut a strip of fabric and I'm going to sew the pockets to the strip of fabric and then cut them apart. When I sew them down, I want to leave an opening in each square so that I can turn them right side out. I would like to use 6 individual pieces of fabric to make these pockets. You can do that as well. You don't have to use a strip. Whatever you have on hand will work, as long as you are able to sew around the outside edge and leave an opening for turning. After you've stitched around the outside edges, you'll need to clip the corners before you turn the pockets right side out. You need to push out your corners so you have a nice square pocket. Need to continue with all 6 pockets doing the same thing, clip in the corners, turn them right side out, and pushing out the corners. If you've turned the pockets right side out, you'll need to take them to the ironing board and iron them nice and flat. You will need to turn under the raw edge on each of the pockets and iron it nice and flat so that we can sew over it later and you won't even notice that it's there. Once you've finished ironing all your pockets, you'll want to take them to the sewing machine and sew across the top edge of the pocket. We'll sew about a 1/4 inch from the edge. Now we are ready to work on the background fabric. You will want to lay your squares out on your background fabric and space them the way you want them to be. I made mine about 2 inches apart with a 2-inch border. I then added 2 inches to the overall length and width of the panel so that I would have extra space to trim off later. We're going to add some top stitching and your piece of fabric may shrink a little, so give a little extra space. It's easier to trim it off than it is to add it at the end. So I have cut 2 layers of fabric here. One will be for the front of my panel and one will be for the back of my panel. And I'm going to have to trim them down later, but that's okay. At least I know I have enough fabric. So now I'm going to cut a piece of batting and a piece of interfacing at least as big as the fabric that I just cut, if not bigger. That's up to you. It needs to be at least as big as what you just cut. I'm using heavy non-fusible interfacing for this project. If you don't have it, you don't have to use it. The panel will work. I just like it to be stiff when it's hanging on the wall, and this interfacing tends to stiffen up the project nicely. It's also really easy to sew through. So I've made myself a little sandwich here. I have my background fabric, then my batting, then my interfacing, and now I'm just going to run an iron over it to get the wrinkles out and to make the fabric stick to the batting. From here, we're going to take the material to the sewing machine and do some top stitching. You can really do whatever you want. You can do free motion quilting, or you can just use a regular foot on your sewing machine or a walking foot on your sewing machine and do some straight line stitching. This wavy line that I used is a programmed stitch on my sewing machine. It's a really easy stitch to do. You just set it in your sewing machine and then you mark the center of your wave and you follow that with your presser foot. This panel, I marked the center of the panel with a chalk pencil and then I marked over 2 inches and that's where I sewed, every 2 inches apart. Once you have finished top stitching, you're going to want to cut off the raw edges and square up the panel. For me, it was easiest just to lay my pockets back on the fabric, make sure I had my spacing that I wanted, and then I marked the panel and cut off the raw edges. Make sure you leave enough space for your seam allowances. At the top of this panel, we're going to make a little casing so that we can put a little dowel in there and we have a way to hang it up. This casing, you're going to need a 3-inch wide piece of fabric and you need it to be as long as the width of your panel. We are going to finish this little strip of fabric by turning each end, short end, in a 1/4 inch, a 1/4 inch again, and then taking it to the sewing machine and running a seam down it. The length of this casing should now be about 1 inch shorter than the width of the panel. We are going to set our casing aside for now and work on sewing down the pockets. You're going to want to space them out like you want and pin them down. Once you have all of your pockets pinned down, you're going to take them to the sewing machine and you're going to sew the 3 sides down. So far we haven't sewed up the hole that we had in each pocket for turning it right side out, so you're going to want to make sure that you catch that in your seam allowance. The panel is a little bulky, but you can roll it up to get it under the sewing machine. It will fit under there. You just need to watch your pins because they will poke you. If you used a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew your pockets together, you're going to need to use less than that when you sew them down to this background fabric. You're going to need less than that because you'll need to close up the hole that we have in it for turning it. Now we're nearing the finish line and we're going to sew the back of the panel onto the front of the panel. We're also going to need to include the casing. You're going to need to fold the casing with wrong sides together lengthwise, and you can finger press this or you can take it to the iron. We are going to put the raw edges of the casing to the raw edge of the top of the panel, and we're going to center it. You can pin this in place or clip it in place if you would like. Now we're going to add our background fabric, the piece that we're going to use on the back of our panel, and we would put right sides together. For this black fabric that I'm using, it doesn't matter, both sides are the same. You're going to want to line up your raw edges on 2 sides of this fabric, especially the top with the casing. You're going to want that nice and flush so that you can sew it in place. Just double check that you have the raw edges of your casing lined up with the raw edges of the top of your panel and that it's centered. When we sew our side seams, we don't want to catch the casing in the sides of the panel. When we originally cut the back fabric and the front fabric for our panel, we cut them at the same size. So we've trimmed the front panel after quilting, so we are going to have to cut this back fabric down. I'm pinning the top edge here, you see, so that I can line up the casing, and I'm going to pin the right side of this fabric, and then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to trim it so that the back fabric is the same size as the front fabric. So I'm making sure that 2 edges of my panels or raw edges are lined up perfectly so that when I flip this over, I only have to trim 2 edges. I have pinned 2 sides and now I'm going to flip it and I'm going to trim off the other 2 sides. I'm going to finish pinning my panel and I'm going to mark an opening where I want to leave to turn it right side out. I normally do that with 2 pins so I have a starting point and a stopping point and I don't forget. You can leave your opening in any side of the panel. It really doesn't matter. I just chose the bottom. I just wouldn't leave the opening in the top since you have the casing there. You want to make sure that's nice and secure. You're going to sew completely around your panel, back stitching at the 2 pins that you pin in, or where you start and where you stop, so it's secure. And you want to make sure your seam allowance is about 1/4 inch. You don't want to catch the casing in your side seam allowance. You want to make sure the casing is caught in the top of the panel so it's nice and strong, but not in the side seams. When you finish sewing your panel together, you'll want to clip your corners and turn the panel right side out. You'll need a little tool for poking out your corners so they're nice and square. Now we're going to have to close up that opening. We're going to turn under our raw edges and we're going to iron it in place and pin it. We're going to sew completely around the panel so that we can close up that opening. We need our seam allowance to be less than 1/4 inch to do this. Well, that completes this project and it's looking pretty good. Project number 4, small backpack. For this project, you'll need 4 adjoining squares. You'll need contrasting fabric for the back of the bag and contrasting fabric for the lining of the bag. For the back of your bag, you'll cut 1 piece of fabric the exact same size as your 4 squares. For the lining of your bag, you will cut 2 pieces of fabric the exact same size as your squares. So you should have 4 pieces of fabric cut the exact same size. 2 pieces for your lining, 1 piece for the front of your bag, which would be your squares, and 1 piece for the back of your bag. For your rope casing, you will need 2 3-inch strips of fabric that are cut a half an inch shorter than the width of your 4 squares. You will need 2 pieces of rope that's approximately 52 inches each. You will need 2 eyelets or grommets that have about a half an inch opening. You may need the kit if you don't already have that. It comes with a little hammering tool. You select your rope and your grommets or your eyelets. You just want to make sure that they work together. The rope should go through the grommet easily and slide back and forth. To start your backpack, you're going to take the strips of fabric that you have for your rope casing and you're going to finish the ends. You're going to turn them in 1/4 of an inch and then 1/4 of an inch again and then stitch. Once you've finished the ends of your casing strips, you're going to fold them in half, wrong sides together, and iron them. Once you've ironed your casing, you're now going to sew them in place. You're going to take the raw edges of your casing and match them with the top of your front panel. You're going to center that in place, and then you're going to take a piece of your lining and you're going to put right sides together, the right side of your lining with the right side of your 4 squares together, matching your raw edges, and you are going to sew across the top of this where the casing is. You want to make sure you keep your casing centered. You can pin that in place or you can use clips. Once you have your casing in place, you'll take it to the sewing machine and do a 1/4 inch seam down the top of the bag. Next, you'll take the piece of fabric that you have selected for the back of your bag. You'll take that other casing strip and you'll center it, raw edges together, and then you'll put a piece of lining on top of this and sandwich the casing in place. You will be putting right sides together. For some reason, the squares that you have selected for this bag, 4 of them don't equal a perfect square. Make sure you have this lined up so that this is the top of the back of your bag that you're putting your casing to. Pin your casing in place as you did before and take this piece to the sewing machine and do a 1/4 inch seam across the top of this piece, securing the casing in place. Here is a view of the 1/4 inch seam. Here's a view of the casing sewn in place. It should be centered, and we're going to take that to the ironing board and we're going to iron this nice and flat. you're going to iron both pieces that you just sewed so that the right sides are out and it's nice and flat. After you've finished ironing, you are going to layer your fabric. You're going to put right side of lining to right side of lining. You will want to make sure your fabric is very flat and smoothed out. You'll pin these together, lining up your raw edges. Once you have it pinned together, you're going to sew down the right side, the bottom, and up the left side. You're going to backstitch at the beginning and the end. You want your seam allowance on this project to be slightly less than 1/4 of an inch for this first seam. You'll need to clip your corners. You've clipped your corners, you'll want to go along the raw edge and clip off any long strings that you have. We're going to make a French seam, and if you have any long strings, they'll hang out when you're finished the project. Once you've clipped your corners and you've trimmed up your raw edges so you have no long strings hanging, you'll want to turn the bag inside out, and you want to push out the corners. We are going to sew a seam all the way around this bag again, but first we're going to iron it nice and flat. So we are going to be creating a French seam in this bag, and a French seam is great because it encloses the raw edges and it makes the seam twice as strong. And this is great for a child's backpack or any backpack in particular. So for this to work, we have to sew a seam down the side of this bag that is slightly wider than the seam allowance that we have in a bag. So earlier I said sew the seam a little less than 1/4 of an inch. Now we want to sew the seam a little more than 1/4 of an inch so that we encase that raw edge. And also the reason I told you to clip off any stray strings, they would hang out if they're long. Take this to the sewing machine and we'll sew around the bag again. We need to clip the corners when we're done sewing because we have a lot of bulk in the corners. We'll turn our bag right side out. We will push out our corners. Now we'll get ready for our grommets. Now we want to mark the location of our grommets. To do this, take the smaller part of your grommet and just mark the location with a pencil or a marker. You're not going to see the marking, it'll be covered with the grommet. You're going to need to cut this hole out some way. I usually use a pair of scissors, and you want to make sure that you keep the hole as small as you can. It's better to have the hole a little on the smaller size than to cut it too big. Normally your eyelets come with two pieces that fit together. One is longer than the other. That is usually the smaller one that you'll put through your hole, and then it'll have a backing that goes onto it. The longer piece actually gets bent down to hold it in place. When you're putting these together, you want to put the piece that has the longer section on the pretty side of your bag, because the other side that you're going to be banging on will be bent down, so it's not as attractive looking. So when you're doing these eyelets or grommets, you want to follow what's on your packaging for your directions. And I would suggest you get a block of wood to put these on so you don't damage your table or the surface that you're working on. And I normally take mine outside so that I don't mess up my table. I would suggest that if you've never put an eyelet in before, that you do a practice run before you do it on your bag. It's very easy to do, but sometimes the first one you do, you're a little hesitant and you might not get it hammered exactly the right way. Now we'll work on the rope for the bag. It's pretty easy to do. To add the rope, if you start on the left side of the bag, you run the rope through the front casing to the right side. Then you loop the rope through the back casing, coming through to the left side. Then you're going to take the rope that's in the front, put it through the eyelet, and then you're going to tie the two pieces of rope together. And you want your rope nice and relaxed. You want it just laying relaxed, not pulled tight and not with any extra. And you're just going to knot it. Now I'm going to run another piece of rope coming from the right side. To make it easier to get the rope through the casing, you can simply tape the rope to a wood stick and use the wood stick to push through the casing. This piece of rope, we're starting on the right side. We're going to go through the front casing, and then we're going to loop through the back casing. We're coming out the right sides, and we want the raw ends of our rope to meet. Take our rope that's coming out the front casing and put it through the eyelet. Then we're going to take the end of our ropes and tie them together. As before, you want to make your rope so that it's relaxed and you don't have any extra rope or any pull on the rope when you tie the knot. Once you have your knots where you want them to be, you'll want to pull them really tight so they don't slip out. If the bag has been threaded correctly, you should be able to pull on the right and left side and get the bag to easily cinch. The last thing to do is to cut off the extra rope and melt it if you like. I usually take it outside and put a torch to it to melt the ends so they don't fray. Well, that's it. We've finished Project 4 and it's looking really good. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.